Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Plato by Constance Meinwald. This is a fairly recent book published in 2016, and it's part of a series, the Routledge Philosophers. Routledge is a publishing company. They've put out a whole series of books on various philosophers. They all have the same cover, so you'll see other books. Maybe if you explore philosophy books, you'll see others with this same cover. And they're all just sort of overviews of the philosophies of various individuals. And so this is a little more recent than I usually do. I prefer books that are a little older, but this one's pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and look at it. I'm only going to look at chapter 7. She talks a lot about Plato, his life, some of the symposium, and some of his other writings, and she talks a lot about the forms. In the later part of the book, she talks about the forms. There's just a pretty wide array of aspects of Platonic philosophy that she examines. Like I said, I only want to look at chapter 7, which is where she talks about the Republic. The Republic is Plato's most well-known book, and I don't want to get into the ideals or the forms. I don't really want to get into the deep examination of the nature of the human soul. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. Some of it, in the beginning, it's pretty straightforward. As it goes on toward the end of the book, as she starts talking about the forms, it gets more complex and maybe harder to understand. Some parts of it I found a little bit challenging. But the section that I want to read here about the Republic is not particularly challenging. It's a good overview, so that's what I want to focus on. As in all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections and then provide a little bit of analysis. And I'm going to go ahead and start reading a section here from chapter 7 where she talks about eudaimonia. And here she says, quote, "In antiquity, it was assumed, and assumed to be unproblematic, that what each of us wants more than anything is to achieve eudaimonia, happiness, the good life. Remember that happiness, when it translates eudaimonia, is not a matter of feeling cheerful, but is something that is won over the entirety of a well-favored life, human flourishing. The theme question of ancient ethics was tantamount to, how can I be happy? And the different philosophical schools thought they were making contributions of enormous practical importance when they undertook research on this topic. Their answers competed directly with others that were around in the culture, such as the traditional notion that the good life is the life of the person with social position or beauty or health, or the rather more cynical beliefs that money or power are what it takes. In fact, at an abstract level, there was an answer to the question, how can I be happy, that was guaranteed to be correct. Human excellence or virtue, Greek arete, in the fundamental meaning of the term, must put us in a position to achieve the good life. For the excellence or virtue of anything that has a characteristic work, function, or performance is what enables the performance to be done well, as both Book 1 of the Republic and Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics spell out. We still follow the descendant of this usage when we speak in musical contexts of a virtuoso, a person who is able to perform well the characteristic repertoire of their instrument. So a person with Greek arete would be, so to speak, a virtuoso of life. While the conceptual link between happiness and virtue, in the fundamental sense, guarantees that virtue is key for happiness, simply knowing that is not informative. For if we do not know which life is the good life, we cannot know what virtue really amounts to. The conventional list of cardinal virtues, including justice, dikaiosune, piety, bravery, moderation or sophrosine, and wisdom, was already familiar in Plato's day. But are these really the things that put us in a position to live the good life? That is, are they really virtues in our fundamental sense? That could, of course, be challenged. End quote. So that's a pretty short section, but the idea here is pretty straightforward. People want more than anything. She says each of us wants more than anything to achieve eudaimonia. This was assumed in the ancient Greek world that what we're all after is eudaimonia. And so what is eudaimonia? Well, it's often translated as happiness, but it's not really happiness. It's something more expansive than just happiness. Happiness in our terminology is more of a momentary thing. Like, I'm happy right now. Tomorrow I may not be happy. I'm happy because I'm in a circumstance that makes me happy. I'm happy because I'm thinking about something that makes me happy. It's a temporary state of being, happiness. Whereas eudaimonia is more of a lifelong thing. So a better translation, and one that she mentions here, is human flourishing. And it's even been considered, I read somewhere, I don't recall where exactly I read, but the idea that eudaimonia extends beyond your death, that if after you die, your children dishonor your name, then you have lost some amount of eudaimonia even after you're dead. So that you want to live a flourishing life, you want to live a rewarding life, and you want to go down in history as one of the ancestors who is respected, who was the head of a family line that was successful, that you were an adequate link in the chain from ancestors to descendants. You did your part for the city. You did your part for your family line, for your clan, for your tribe. You've done your part in society, and you are well regarded in your life and after your life. So it's the full picture of a life well lived, right? That's eudaimonia, a good life. So that's obviously not just happiness. Happiness, I think, is a very inadequate translation. But then the question is, how do you become happy? And that's really the question of ethics. The ancient examination of ethics and philosophy was an examination of how do I achieve eudaimonia? And she says, well, there's one obvious answer to the question, and that is virtue and excellence. Arete is the Greek word, and it's translated both as virtue and excellence, and it's a little bit of both. We've talked about arete in previous episodes. The idea simply is that if you're good at what you do, if you're good at being a human, if you have the right qualities, the best qualities, if eudaimonia is the objective, then whatever quality it is that gets you to eudaimonia is a sort of excellence. It's the necessary qualities to achieve the desired function of the human being. So, like a knife has arete if it does what a knife is supposed to do, if it's sharp. If a knife is dull, it does not have arete. It is not an excellent knife. It is not a virtuous knife. It is a substandard knife. So arete, excellence, virtue are the things that you do, the qualities that you have as a human that enable you to perform your human function well enough to get you to eudaimonia. Arete is the path to eudaimonia, and arete is generally translated as virtue. So when Socrates is asking what is virtue, what he's asking is, what is arete? What are the qualities that people need to possess in order to achieve eudaimonia? And that's what early ethical philosophy was all about. That's what Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics was trying to uncover. What are the virtues? And it was presumed that there was more than one just single, simple virtue. Arete could be like the umbrella term that says, oh, I have virtue, I am virtuous, I have arete. But that breaks down into a number of component virtues. And those classical cardinal virtues were understood back in the day to essentially be, this is the conventional list of cardinal virtues, and she lists justice, piety, bravery, moderation, and wisdom. And we've certainly heard of some of these before: justice or dikaiosune, moderation or sophrosony. Those I think are very important. Sophrosony is just the idea of moderation or sophrosony has always sort of been especially interesting to me because it relates to Aristotle and his golden mean. It's moderation, a balancing of this and that, not going too far in any one direction. But in a way, sophrosony could be seen to govern the other virtues, so that you're balancing your sense of justice with your sense of bravery, with your sense of piety, and with your wisdom. And yet, wisdom could be said to be also the overarching virtue that determines, how you uncover what those virtues are through wisdom. You know when you're going too far in one direction or too far in another direction. How do you know what that golden mean is? You have wisdom to know that. You have a sensibility. You have a sense of what you can kind of intuit what justice is. I think that, in a sense, is wisdom. If you know what the just course is, if you know what the virtuous course is, if you know when to be brave, how much bravery is recklessness, and where that correct amount of the various attributes, or both the correct amount of the various virtues as well as the correct amount of other emotions, like Aristotle had talked about. Being angry is not necessarily bad if you're angry at the right time for the right reasons. And so wisdom would really tell you when you should be angry, how angry you should be, who you should be angry at, whether anger is the appropriate response or anger is not the appropriate response. So wisdom is a guiding force. Sophrosony is a guiding force. But they're all kind of bundled in here to this list of cardinal virtues. And so what Plato's doing is he's examining, is this really the list of virtues? And what do these things mean? What is justice? What is moderation? What are they? Can we put a definition on them? And as we saw in the last episode, Socrates is after these hard, fast, perfect, absolute definitions. So that's kind of Plato's objective in the Republic, is to pin down one of these, and that is justice. The other virtues are sort of set aside for the purpose of the Republic, and he zeroes in on an examination of what justice is. And that's really the plot of the Republic, is an attempt to define justice. So moving on, I'm going to read this section here where she talks about the question of what justice is and how it's introduced in the book. She says, quote, Socrates starts off, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, the son of Ariston. They went to see the first observance at Athens of the festival of Bendis, a goddess adopted from Thrace. Having done this, they were accosted by Polemarchus, who prevailed on them to go home with him. The Piraeus, still a major port today, had been the creation of the first Greek civic planner. Socrates will be planning a sort of psychic layout of his utopia. Like other port districts, the Piraeus was not the home of high society. It was the base especially of non-citizen aliens, like the family of Polemarchus, Lysias, and their father Cephalus, who had come to Athens from the Greek colony of Syracuse. It was naturally home as well to the navy and to a certain criminal element. In the time of the 30, still in the future at the dramatic date of the dialogue, but in the past by the date of composition, the Piraeus was a center of opposition to the regime. So much so that men of the Piraeus became a way of referring to those who helped restore the democracy. Soon after the dramatic date of the dialogue, both Polemarchus and Niceratus, the son of Nicias, were killed and expropriated by the 30. Even the mention of the festival may hint at the political convulsions of Athens and those who were especially involved in them. The Temple of Bendis was the location of the battle in which the democratic forces overturned the 30 in 403. Critias and Charmides were both killed in the battle. Our dialogue will contain a study of kinds of regime that will show what was wrong with the 30 and with the Athenian democracy. Each case exemplifies a different defective form. Once he has arrived at the home of Polemarchus, Socrates is involved in a series of encounters recounted in Book 1, like those we are familiar with from the Socratic dialogues. Because the division into books has to do with how much text could fit onto a single roll of papyrus, for much of the Republic that division doesn't have any particular significance. The first book, however, is a meaningful unit. The conversation arises out of some remarks of Polemarchus's father, Cephalus, who tells Socrates that now that he has passed the gratifications of youth, he enjoys philosophy, prompting his visitor to ask him for a scouting report concerning his time of life. Cephalus says that while many of his contemporaries complain about the indignities of old age, it isn't really age that makes these hard to bear, but a person's character. For those who are civilized and contented, then even old age is only a slight burden. Otherwise, for those who are not like this, both old age and youth prove hard to cope with. Socrates tells us that he admired this and wanted to hear more. To prompt Cephalus, he suggests that many won't accept what he has said, but assume it is Cephalus's wealth and not his character that makes old age easy for him. The wealthy, they say, have many consolations. Yet the old man claims that the real value of his wealth is to have protected him from the fear of punishment in the afterlife. He has not been pressed by need to lie or to cheat anyone, so his wealth has enabled him to avoid wrongdoing or injustice. This leads Socrates to ask whether telling the truth and repaying deposits is what justice, dikaiosune, really is. He immediately comes up with a famous counterexample. What if a friend had deposited a weapon with you and demanded it back during a manic episode? End quote. So here we see the beginning of the Republic, the beginning of the book, The Republic, where Socrates says basically he went down to the Piraeus, or the port of Athens, to see a festival, which is apparently the first festival, the first observance of the festival of Bendis, a goddess adopted from Thrace. We don't hear much about Bendis other than in the Republic. Among the famous Greek gods, Zeus, Demeter, Hermes, Apollo, we don't really hear about Bendis. Bendis is adopted from a foreign land, from Thrace. And it is the center of opposition to the 30. So when there was the conflict between the 30, and which were the 30 tyrants, an attempt to return Athens to the oligarchy, there was a conflict between the Democrats and the 30 and their supporters, the oligarchs and their supporters, and there was a fight. And the fight, apparently, the final major battle of this conflict happened at the Temple of Bendis. I've seen a couple of different people talk about how significant or symbolic some of the early components of Book 1, the framing, actually are to what the book is about. She doesn't really get into that here an awful lot. She does mention some of the relevance of the Piraeus, and perhaps indicating, hinting at the conflict between the Democrats and the 30, and the Republic intending to show the problems with both the 30 and the Athenian democracy. But she doesn't make an awful lot out of that. Essentially, there's an old man, Cephalus, who is talking about what it's like to be old, how he's past the passions of youth, the madness of youth, and he's settled into his old age, and he enjoys philosophy. And Socrates is asking him what it's like to be old, and he says basically, the old man says basically, it depends on your character. If you're civilized and contented, then old age isn't really so bad. But if you're not civilized, you're not contented, if you have a distraught soul, then both old age and youth are both hard to deal with. And Socrates says, well, are you sure it's not just the fact that you're wealthy that has made your old age easy to deal with, as opposed to your character? Maybe it was just your wealth. Some people say that that's really what is going to provide you with a comfortable old age, is to not be poverty-stricken. That's a realistic assessment. But Cephalus, the old man, says, well, the only thing that the wealth really did was enable him to have enough money to not have to steal, to not have to cheat, to not have to lie, to not have to commit injustice during his life, so that he can die with a clear conscience. That's what wealth enabled him to do, to not have to be an unjust person in order to make ends meet. He was able to live a just life, and his wealth helped him to do that. And so then thus begins the question that occupies the whole book. Well, is it really justice, the fact that you didn't cheat anybody, you lived a generally honest life, you didn't steal anything from people? Is it justice to not lie, not steal, and not cheat? Is that really what justice is? To say that you lived a just life because of those things? And from there it unfolds into a sprawling examination of what justice is. So, this is, again, the sort of thing that we talked about in the last episode as regards definitions. So at first it seems like, yeah, that sounds like a fair definition. The old man says that justice is giving to people what they're owed. If someone deserves something, then you give it to them. If you go and you buy something and you get what you bought, but then you run off and you don't pay, you dine and dash, or as the case may be, you basically don't give someone what they're owed, what you owe them. You deny them the things that they're owed. Then you have committed an injustice. If someone deserves punishment and they elude that punishment, again, they're not given what they're owed. They're owed punishment and they don't get the punishment, then an injustice has occurred. When people receive the rewards and the punishments that they're owed, that they deserve, they're just rewards, they're just punishments, then that's what justice is, giving people what they deserve, what they're owed. And then Socrates, of course, will always come up with an example, some sort of an example that will prove the exception to the rule. And through these continually supplying these various examples, undermine every definition that's put forward. And this is sort of what Socrates does. So Socrates says, well, if someone loaned you a sword, and then in a fit of rage, they wanted to get their sword back so that they could go kill someone who maybe didn't really deserve to die, but this person's they're furious about something. They're overtaken by rage, a manic anger, and they're going to do something bad with the sword, and they want the sword. Is it just for you to give them the sword simply because it's their sword and they've loaned it to you? Well, it's like when someone's drunk and you take their keys away. That's their keys, their car. Is it just to take their keys and not give it to them? So the question of whether giving people things that they're owed or taking things from people that belong to them, the question arises whether that's really justice. So let's move on from there. This sort of goes back and forth a little bit about justice, and then Thrasymachus jumps in. So let's talk about that a little bit. She says, quote, Thrasymachus of Chalcedon was a sophist, famous for his ability to arouse and allay emotion in his audience. His name means bold in battle, and indeed he strikes many readers as a man of anger. His approach is also shaped by his professional status. He expects to make a successful display that will win him future pupils and their fees, and can literally not afford to admit defeat. The famous blush of Thrasymachus when he fails to maintain his position under questioning by Socrates is to be understood in this context. Thrasymachus is the one in our dialogue who introduces the position that justice is another's good, the interest of whoever, being in power, is in a position to make the rules, which they do for their advantage, not mine. Making him the spokesman for this gives us a sympathetic angle on it, if we take into account that his home city of Chalcedon had tried to revolt from Athens and failed in the attempt. We can see his cynical view, that justice is what the stronger tells you to do for their good, as a natural consequence of the real politic of Athenian foreign relations. The experience of his city also explains why he regards another's good, the advantage of the stronger, and what the stronger lays down in law as equivalent. Some have complained that these can diverge. If I am ruler, then the advantage of the stronger is not another's good but my own. Likewise, what benefits the ruler and what is in fact legal can come apart. If we keep in mind that Thrasymachus' passion represents the experience of the oppressed, told what to do, all dressed up in fancy terms, but really determined by the pursuit of self-interest on the part of the oppressor who makes the rules, we can perhaps see why his position comes out as it does. Another's good seems equivalent to the advantage of the stronger, if one is oneself stuck in the position of the dominated. It also suits the casting of Thrasymachus as the interlocutor, that while Cephalus and Polemarchus had been talking about how an individual treats other individuals, the discussion with him includes mention of how a city treats other cities. Plato shows here that, despite the impressions of some readers, he is well aware that justice in a city has to do not only with the relations of its own citizens to each other, but also with the external relations of the city to other cities. As the Republic unfolds, readers will see that internal and external matters are actually connected. Overall, Thrasymachus cannot maintain his position any more successfully than any other victim of Socratic elenkos. But generations of readers have felt that the discussion has not been sufficiently satisfying. Even though each of the little arguments Socrates lures him into leads to its contradiction, some of the sophists' individual claims have gut appeal. Maybe Socrates is naive to think of a shepherd as exercising his craft for the sake of the flock, rather than for the sake of whatever the owner wants to get from the animals. Maybe Socrates is equally naive to think a ruler's true objective is the good of the ruled. End quote. So there we see an echo of the last book as well, with a conversation about the shepherd, and the idea that in any way you could compare the rulership of a city to the stewarding of a shepherd over a flock. The way the shepherd looks after the sheep is similar to the way a ruler looks after a city, but it can't be discounted that the only reason the shepherd does that is so that he can eat the sheep or sell the sheep for someone else to eat. He's really after his own benefit. He looks after the flock only as a temporary measure to move him closer toward fulfilling his own personal objectives of acquiring money and food. He's not really interested in the well-being of the sheep in a fundamental sense. It's only instrumental. It's only an instrumental concern that's really dedicated to his own interest. And for Socrates to sort of make this comparison, make this claim and comparison about rulers and shepherds is just naive and foolish. And if a ruler is like a shepherd, then really Thrasymachus is right, because the whole stewardship of the city, the whole leadership and the laws that get set down by the leaders of the city for how the people, the citizens of the city, must behave, those are all set down by the rulers for their own benefit. They ultimately are after something for themselves, whether it's glory or money or survival or whatever it may be, some comfort, something that the rulers are after for themselves. They're not really interested in the well-being of the city itself any more than a shepherd is interested in the well-being of the sheep. Now, that's one way to look at it. Of course, that doesn't take into consideration the fact that a ruler is really not a shepherd. The shepherd doesn't share any relationships with the sheep. The shepherd isn't brother or cousin or father or uncle or whatever, or best friends with any of the sheep. The ruler doesn't really have an interest in the sheep thriving for their own good in the way that a family member has an interest in other family members thriving for their own good. And you can look at that in a genetic sense, that it does come back to the self-interest of one's genes when when you're talking about like kin selection and the genetic replication and the genetic survival of genetic code that is involved with advancing the interests of people who share some amount of your genetic code. Obviously, these guys aren't thinking you were talking about genetics, but the relationship of a ruler who is a member of a particular tribe wants to see that tribe do well because he has kin in the tribe, and he wants to see his kin do well, and he wants to see his kin do well because ultimately he's compelled toward in-group preference and kin selection by biology. And that's not something that a shepherd has in his relationships with his sheep. There's no real interest in the well-being of the sheep other than an exploitative interest. And that's not the same for clans and tribes and families and things like that. Like a father doesn't want to see his kids succeed for an exploitative reason. He wants to see his kids succeed because they share his genetics. And that's not, right? That's not something that can be compared to a shepherd and sheep. So anyway, let's move on from there. We now get to the argument from Glaucon. And this is interesting and very well known, and this has come up in other previous books. This topic came up in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where he talks about justice and ethics and self-interest a little bit. That was a great book, by the way. I would definitely recommend go back and listen to that episode because I talk about some of the most important parts of that book there, and Glaucon comes up. But here, the author says, quote, Glaucon brings in an early version of social contract theory. The origin of justice is that people have agreed neither to do nor to suffer wrong, in order to avoid the worst-case scenario, which is being helplessly wronged. For someone able to wrong others with impunity, though, that would be the best of all. He proposes a famous thought experiment that is supposed to show that what anyone's nature naturally pursues as good is where they are led by the desire to outdo others and get more and more, while nature is forced by law into the perversion of treating fairness with respect. He does this by telling a story in which the ancestor of Gyges, the Lydian, came across what seemed to be a giant corpse under awesome circumstances and took a ring from the body. When he discovered that turning the ring made him invisible, the erstwhile shepherd used his newfound superpower to seduce the queen, kill the king, and mount the throne. Glaucon says that if granted the same license, no one would stick to justice. The thought experiment works by severing unjust behavior from the usual social consequences punishing it. So if Glaucon's claim is correct, it shows that no one values justice for itself. Justice is only instrumentally good, and only under certain circumstances. Ordinary just behavior is motivated by the wish to avoid punishment and gain the good reputation that in turn allows one to form desirable marriage alliances, business partnerships, etc. And even those benefits are not from what justice inherently is, but from our being seen to be just. Because of this, they can just as well go to a skillful, unjust person who provides himself with a reputation for justice and has as well the resources to correct any slips he may make. Adeimantus reinforces his brother by showing at length that the traditional recommendations to justice by parents and poets are all along the lines of crime doesn't pay. Such advice doesn't begin to suggest that justice is valuable for itself. Moreover, those very same authorities also indicate that we can get away with injustice. They tell us of how we may trick our fellow human beings and propitiate the gods with sacrifices and rites. Let's now sum up the position the brothers have taken. It looks as if just behavior is normally chosen, when it is, because of what will come to us as a result of being seen to be just. Yet the unjust, if they project a false appearance, can reap these rewards in addition to all the other benefits that come from their unimpeded pursuit of their own advantage. End quote. So here we see Glaucon and his brother Adeimantus making the argument that justice is something that people have agreed on. A bunch of people in forming a society have all sort of agreed to follow certain rules that they call justice. It's not necessarily just for the benefit of those in power, but it's for the benefit of everybody. That nobody wants to have injustice pursued against him and not have any recourse, to be wronged by other people and not have any recourse. So in order to have a functional society, everybody just sort of takes on just behavior in agreement with one another. We're all going to behave justly so that society can function and so that nobody gets screwed over. But if you can screw other people over, if you can act unjustly, and you know that you won't have any consequences for it. In other words, you find the ring of Gyges and it allows you to become invisible. And so you can steal and you can murder people and you can do all sorts of unjust behaviors and you'll never get caught because you have this magic ring that lets you do things while invisible. Lets you escape from the crime scene, lets you do, all sorts of things that you could do if you had this magic invisible ring of invisibility, that anybody would take advantage of that and commit unjust deeds because they know that there's no consequences. So the idea is justice is really just an agreed upon set of behavior to keep society functioning smoothly, but it's not really what we're all after for its own sake. Nobody wants to be just for justice's sake. We want to be just because of the benefits that we get. And we avoid injustice because we want to avoid the punishments. And like the parents and the teachers say to their kids, crime doesn't pay. If you're unjust, you'll suffer the consequences. There are consequences to your actions. And those consequences come about as a result of other people seeing your unjust behavior and no longer wanting to associate with you or punishing you with the law, bringing you to court, or killing you, or whatever it may be. Some sort of ramifications for your unjust act, but the ramifications come from other people who have observed your injustice. And if you could avoid other people observing your injustice, then, in fact, crime would pay. Because there would be no consequences, but only the benefits that you get from engaging in unjust behavior, stealing and taking over the kingdom, killing the king and taking the throne and seducing the wife and all the other, the queen and all the other things that Gyges does or the descendant of Gyges does. So this is a pretty powerful argument. And Jonathan Haidt, in his book, he said, well, actually, this is dismantled in a way by Socrates, but the truth is that Glaucon really does have a pretty solid argument here, that justice really is something that we all just sort of agree on in order to have a functional society. Now, I think that it goes deeper than that, because I think there's an evolutionary quality to this, which is that we have a sort of morality hardwired into our minds that we've acquired through evolutionary processes, so that we tend to have some sort of basic moral shape of our ethics and behavior that's innate to us. And so people wouldn't, if they could get away with it, wouldn't necessarily do all of the unjust things, because in some sense, right? They would have some sense of shame. They'd have some sense of eidos. They'd have some sense that what they have done is wrong, and it would feel sort of repulsive to them to commit too much injustice. They would begin to loathe themselves in a way. Now, you might say this is only the internalized rules of society, but I think that that this is more biologically inherent than just the rules of society. But we don't. I mean, that's such a thing is pretty hard to demonstrate. The difference between innate behavior and internalized social norms. How you can really separate that unless you've truly identified the structures in the brain that drive moral behavior. And in some sense, I think with like very young children and babies, we can identify some aspects of moral behavior that could potentially be too early in a person's life to identify. But I think this is still a sort of open question. It's definitely an interesting area of study, but I do think that Glaucon has a fairly strong argument that is perhaps too quickly dismissed by Socrates in his quest to show that that justice as a virtue is beneficial on its own terms, in itself is beneficial to a person. And this doesn't, it may be beneficial on its own terms to a society. It may be beneficial on its own terms to an individual, but it's in how that individual interacts with society. Someone who behaves justly is less likely to be murdered or ostracized or otherwise impeded by their society. And so there's an evolutionary selective process that people who are too unjust not only suffer the consequences in the here and now, but they don't pass on their unjust genes because society stops them before they can do so. That's a potential theory of biological morality. So anyway, let's keep moving a little bit into really the meat and potatoes of the Republic, which is the concept of the city, the Callipolis, which translates essentially to beautiful city. The Republic that is, the namesake of the dialogue, when they decide that they're going to sketch out an outline of a city. So she says, quote, "While justice in the individual person had been the main focus initially, Socrates will turn to the justice of a city in meeting the challenge. He uses a charming analogy to explain why he proposes to found a city in thought. If we were faced with reading something written in tiny letters and had reason to believe the same message was magnified hugely somewhere, it would make sense to look at the big letters first. Then we could go back to the miniature message, and with a definite possibility in mind, it would be easier to make out the letters, if they were indeed the same. Notice that he does not propose that we will just assume that we know the small message as soon as we have looked at the jumbotron, just that having looked at the larger script will make it easier to read the smaller. So, too, since a city and an individual may each be just, we will proceed by first looking at justice writ large, and then return to consideration of the case of the individual. We now start with Socrates' foundation in thought of his ideal city. The discussion develops naturally into a huge range of ramifying topics, many of which are of considerable independent interest. It will help to be aware from the start that, for our present purpose, the key result will be the structure of the city that emerges. There are 3 kinds of citizens, with 3 kinds of roles in the life of the community. Socrates devotes considerable attention to the question of how the city may aid the development of citizens who are appropriate members of each of the constituent groups. The diverse ramifying topics typically arise in connection with the discussion of aspects of that plan. The starting point from which cities come into being is agreed in our text to be a circumstance of which people in antiquity were very aware, that a human being in isolation is not viable. I need to be part of a community, because I cannot, on my own, raise food, transport water, build a house, make shoes and clothing, forge tools, etc. This also makes it immediately apparent that within the city, each person should not do each of those things for him or herself. If that were possible, there would have been no need for a city in the first place. Our text points out that if we each specialize in a proprietary task for which we are naturally suited, we will be able to become skillful and hit opportune moments, and the jobs the group as a whole needs will be done optimally and with optimal efficiency. End quote. So the premise here, that pretty simple, that it's hard to identify justice in an individual person, what is just and what isn't just, and what the benefit of justice is, and so on. It's a challenging topic, but he says, well, if we were to sketch out the outline of a just city, and we were to examine what makes the city just, then we could sort of translate that back to the individual. The idea being that the small things are, like small words would be hard to read, but if we had reason to believe those same words were written elsewhere largely, we could read the large words and then go back to the small words and have some sort of an inkling of what they say, and they might be easier to read. That's the premise. And it's a valuable premise, it's a valuable exercise, but it only can go so far because a city is not a person, and what's just in a city may not be just in a person. What's possible for a city may not be possible for a person, but at least as a premise, it's worth exploring. So from that point on, the bulk of the book is the attempt to sketch out the outline of a just city and what it would look like. And here's where we get into like a lot of the criticisms of the Republic, that the so-called just city is in many ways unfeasible. It could never really happen. Now, it's not, maybe its intention is not to be like, hey, here's the city we're going to found. Here's what we want it to look like in reality. Here's what we expect to happen with this city. It's not an attempt to actually found a city. It's an attempt to sketch out a vision of an idealized just city so that we can get an idea of what justice is in the individual. So that should be kept in mind among the criticisms of the Republic for its communism and for its tyranny and for its various unbelievable, unrealistic, unattainable aspects, that it's not ever really intended to be an actual city. But it does bring the question of, if the city as described is not really possible, and yet it is the just city, then you might say that justice in the city is not possible. And then you might be able to infer from that justice in the individual is not really possible. Just like the idea that people are going to find the ring of Gyges and not use it for self-interested, unjust purposes might be just as unrealistic. If they're sketching out a vision of a city that actually could never exist, then when they translate that into a just individual, they're describing an individual that doesn't exist. That's a reasonable inference, I think. So let's jump from there to the next section, which is the last section that I want to read, which is where they bring, after sketching out the city, they begin to bring it back to the individual. So she says, quote, "The psychological scheme of the Republic improves significantly on previous understanding. Its analogues continue to appear in thinkers, from Aristotle to students of psychology and mind today, who have no investment in anything corresponding to the Callipolis of our text. Since we have taken up this topic already, we may simply remind ourselves of our earlier results. The soul has distinct parts. One is rational, one is spirited, and one appetitive. The rational part is naturally suited to come to grips with the good and all other real natures. In addition to its characteristic desire for understanding, It desires what it takes to be the good of the whole soul. In practical matters, its assessments, choices, and operations can be informed by the understanding of real natures it has achieved. The spirited and appetitive parts, by contrast, go with how things simply strike them. Spirit is concerned with prestige and honor and the competitive values, and gets angry when it takes these to be violated. The appetitive part is concerned with pleasures, typically those of food, drink, and sex. In the context of human society, our appetitive part develops an interest in money and gain. So, drawing on our earlier study of the parts of the soul and their different possible ways of developing, let's take up the dialogue's proposals concerning the cardinal virtues in the individual. For the first three, the analogues of what we said about those virtues in the city seem spot on. A person is wise in virtue of the knowledge of the rational part of the soul, applied on behalf of the whole person. A person is brave, whose spirit rallies so as to maintain the appropriate decisions of the rational part about what to do, even in fearful and threatening circumstances. As we saw, moderation or sophrosity in the individual was actually moved up to help in the discussion of the virtues of the city. It is the condition in which the parts of the soul agree about ruling and being ruled. The rational part is in charge, and the lower parts agree to follow. So, finally, what is justice in the soul? Since on the large scale we identified it as the condition in which each of the three classes did its proper job in the city, the analogous thing in small would be for each of the three parts to do its own work in the soul, and this is what our text proposes. What would that amount to? The rational part must acquire knowledge, including knowledge of the good, all of which it can then apply to determine and desire what is good for the whole soul. Spirit and appetite should each have developed so that the things they desire under their own proprietary descriptions are in fact appropriate. We should appreciate that when the spirited and appetitive parts are doing their jobs properly, they do important work in providing quick awareness of and motivational impulses toward things that we really should go for. It is important that the work of the three parts of our soul isn't just a matter of three separate jobs going on independently. Plato makes this clear when he describes how the just person regulates well what is really his own. He puts himself in order and harmonizes the three parts of himself. He binds together those parts and any others there may be in between. And from having been many things, he becomes entirely one, moderate and harmonious. On the Greek conception, harmony derives from concord, symphonia, also translated consonance, the desirable condition in which different notes make a unity. So the just person is a unity, a well-functioning single soul constituted by psychological parts, each functioning appropriately to make its distinct contribution to the whole. As with a city, a human being in the condition that justice is will eo ipso have the other cardinal virtues. In this sense, Platonic justice is complete human virtue. We might think this revisionist theory of justice incidentally explains why dikaiosune and related terms in some occurrences in ordinary Greek can elicit translations in terms like righteousness. Justice in English, as some of us start out understanding it, doesn't always quite stretch far enough. End quote. So what do we see here? The idea is that the city is ultimately split into three different parts. The soul is split into three parts, and the city is split into three parts. And in the city, the philosopher kings rule, and the guardians protect, and the common workers, provide food and are craftsmen and things like that. They're the masses of people who do the labor, the laborers. Those are the three parts, and they correspond to the three parts of the human soul. The rational part is the philosopher kings, the spirited part is the guardians, and the appetitive part is represented by the workers, the laborers. And so, in a just city, each part knows its proper role. The rational part knows that it rules, and it pursues the good, it identifies the good, pursues the good, learns about nature, understands nature so that the person's actions in a just person conform with nature and don't conflict against it, and can utilize knowledge of nature to advance his own interests. So the rational part must rule and must be able to identify the good. The spirited part must know its role and must defend the body and must defend the resources. And the appetitive part seeks to acquire things, seeks to do the work necessary to get the things one needs to survive. And when each part of the city knows its role, is sort of carved out from the others in the sense that it does this and it doesn't really need or try to do the other things. When each part of the city knows its domain, sticks to its domain, and the other parts agree to follow the rational part or the philosopher kings, then this is a just city, and translated to an individual, that the just individual is ruled by their rationality, maintains a spirited aspect, but the spirited aspect doesn't rule. The part that seeks glory doesn't rule. The appetitive part of the body, the hunger, the thirst, desire for sex, desire for wine, desire for material comfort, plays an important role in a person and in a person's life, but doesn't rule the person. And when these different parts of the person know their role and perform their role and know which one is in charge, then that is the just person. That's the ultimate theory here. I think there's definitely some value to it in the sense that a person should be sort of balanced. They should have different parts of themselves, each doing its own role. But whether that really is justice or righteousness or anything like that, I'm not so sure that that's what justice even means. That, to me, that seems more like sophrosity. That seems more like moderation. All things in their own part, no aspect dominating unjustly, no aspect dominating at the expense of other parts. And maybe it is justice. I mean, I just used the word unjustly so that each part of a person has its domain, and when they impede on other parts of the domain, it's almost like someone is doing injustice to themselves. When my appetitive part dominates all of my activities, maybe I'm being unjust to myself by not allowing the other parts to fulfill their necessary roles. But I do think it's a bit of a stretch to say that that is really what justice is. That might be correct behavior. It might be a correct balancing. It might be a correct sense of internal moderation. But I don't know that that's justice. But anyway, it's certainly an interesting proposal, and it's a question that has been asked and debated from the time of Plato until the present. So I'm going to wrap that up there, and you've got a kind of overview of the Republic, and we'll go more deeply into some Plato and some of the Republic in future episodes. So for now, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.